You are listening to the Choose Your Struggle podcast, a member of the Shameless Podcast Network. This week on the Choose Your Struggle podcast is educator and author Michael Rosino. But first, Kid Mental, let's go.
Things ain't always gonna go our way, but you can always win when you choose your struggle. And some battles are for yesterday, but today is for a new beginning. Choose your struggle, and don't worry about what they say, but you can always win when you choose your struggle. And you can bounce back just as Jay. Come on and listen to Choose Your Struggle. Choose your struggles. Choose your struggle. Choose your struggle.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Choose Your Struggle podcast. As I mentioned, you're hearing this while I am still in Nashville for Pod Movement or Pod Move, whatever, it doesn't matter. Great podcast conference. I'll tell you all about it when I get back. I'm recording this a week in advance, so if something has happened and I'm not talking about it today, that's why. Today's guest is somebody that I saw their work. I read something. I then went and bought the book and blew through it, and then reached out to the author to say I would love to chat for the show. Luckily for me, he checked out the show and was like, oh my God, this is a great show. These are literally a thing he did, which I appreciate, and said, I would love to come on. Let's make it happen. Today's guest is named Michael Rosino. He wrote the book, Debating the Drug War, Race Politics, and the Media. This is a really wonderful book. It's not easy to read. When I say I blew through it, I mean, that was a lie. That was a flat out lie. It took me like 10 days, because it is a dense book and it takes a lot of time to consider what you're reading. This isn't just like a page turner that you can flip through and move on. This really took some time for me to sit with what I was reading. And you know, you'll hear him say this on the show, that was kind of by design, or at least not by design. He worked really hard on this book. He spent 2 years in just the research phase of it alone, reading thousands of online comments, hundreds of newspaper and other media articles. He really dove into this, and I applaud him for that. A quick note on something he talks about. At the end of the show, as always, I asked him to shout out people that we should follow, and he emailed me a couple days later to say, you know, I really blanked on a couple of my favorite organizations. Would you mind shouting them out when you do this show? So here they are. One is Vocal NY, a grassroots organization in New York focusing on homelessness, victims of the drug war, and HIV. And the other one is Critical Resistance, an organization working to abolish prisons. Those both sound awesome. Thank you, Michael, for that. There's their shout out, and you'll hear the rest of his at the end, obviously. Michael is a guy that I think you should all go check out. He is active on social media, but really is just more doing awesome work in the classroom and also with this book. So I'm going to do the same thing I offered with Emily Dufton a couple weeks ago. By the way, shout out to Lauren in Cincinnati for getting the Emily Dufton book. She was the first person to reach out and say that she wanted to get the book. And I said, great, I'm sending it to you. So I'm going to do the same thing this week with Michael Rosino. The first person who hears this and says, hey, I want the book. It's going to be yours. Do not message me and say, hey, I'm buying the book, because, you know, that's kind of defeats the purpose. Message me and say, hey, has anyone claimed it yet? Or, hey, if no one has claimed it, I want the book and I'm going to send it to you. So reach out. I would love to hear from you, and enjoy this conversation with the amazing Michael Rosino. A quick shout out to my Patreon supporters. I am so grateful for your support and your love. Y'all have been with me since almost the beginning, and so much of this podcast could not be done without you. Almost to a person, they've all told me that they didn't join for the perks, although there are some pretty fantastic perks, but they've all joined just to support the show, and it really means so much to me. Now, if you join, you are going to get some stuff in return. You'll get sneak peeks, extra content, and the chance to interact with me on a second level. It's really a great way to show support if you love this show. So go ahead and check it out today. Go to patreon.com/chooseyourstruggle. The lowest tier is only $3.40 a month. And there's multiple tiers after that. There's something for everybody. So I truly mean this. Thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. And if you've been waiting to sign up, well, now's a great time. So head on over to Patreon and show a little bit of love. Choose your struggle. Thanks for sharing the podcast with your friends. If you're listening on Apple, please rate and review or check out the review link in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
So I'm Michael Rosino. I am an assistant professor of sociology at Malloy College, which is in Rockville Center. And I'm learning to say on Long Island instead of in Long Island. I am a sociologist that my work focuses on racial politics, issues around drug policy, media representations. I'm also doing some work right now on grassroots democracy and sort of political organizing as well. So that's kind of my next big project. But I'm broadly interested in questions around racial inequality. Where do the present racial inequalities we have come from? How are they impacting people? And obviously, so much of that is tied to drug policy. So much of that is tied to the various ways that the media and politicians have created certain narratives around drug use and deployed, laws and policies against them. So yeah, I just published my first book. I'm really excited for people to read it. It's called Debating the Drug War. Maybe I should save my plugs to the end, but got to get them in.
We are definitely going to talk about your book. Obviously, that's how you came to my attention. And for the listeners, that book is Debating the Drug War, Race, Politics, and the Media. But before we really get into that, because as I love to joke on this show, that nobody just falls into this work. Nobody wakes up when they're 8 years old and says, I want to study the war on people that we've called the war on drugs. Mm-hmm. So what was it about this that kind of piqued your interest, and how did you get into this line of work?
So I grew up in sort of a predominantly white rural suburb, kind of a nice little suburban bubble. And as I started to really have sort of more experiences around different groups of people, more diversity in my social circle, particularly around race, ethnicity, immigrant status, religion, social class, all those social categories that sociologists love to study. I really became aware of the fact that, our society just doesn't treat all people the same way. And one of the ways that I really noticed that was in just thinking about sort of trying to wrap my head around why it was that certain drugs were treated in certain ways, certain substances. So, like most American teenagers, part of my sort of exploration of myself and my boredom involved, trying different substances, and particularly, I think one of the things that surprised me as much as it, I think, surprises a lot of people growing up. Maybe this is like a light bulb moment for a lot of people who aren't maybe directly impacted by the legal system, is just sort of with that moment when you sort of debunk the dare propaganda that you receive about drugs and drug use, particularly I think around cannabis really being the big one, I think, for a lot of people, that, you begin to realize that, okay, this is actually probably less harsh and sort of less bad for you than alcohol, which is kind of this celebrated substance. I think becoming aware of that sort of inconsistency and hypocrisy, in a very sort of juvenile way, I always kind of had this little sense in my head that maybe something's not right here. And, as I furthered my education, I became really interested in sociology because it was answering a lot of really interesting questions that I had about why people do the things that they do. Why does the world look the way that it does? Why do human beings interact with each other in certain ways? These big questions. And I always thought, okay, these are conversations that you can kind of just have weird debates with your friends. This is, before social media really took off. But nobody's really like making a job out of like answering these questions. And particularly nobody is coming up with any like facts that are like, grounding these in some type of thing, that's based in evidence. And, as I took sociology classes, because I didn't really know what it was, I kind of got hooked. I got the research bug, as a lot of people in academia say. I became really interested in using research methods and thinking about these big questions and grounding them in some type of process that can allow me to kind of own it and actually start to answer some of them for myself. As I went along in my training, I realized that this was a great opportunity for me to further explore some of these questions that I had about drug policy and drug use. And, why are different types of drug use treated differently? Why are different populations treated differently for drug use? Where does all this hypocrisy and inconsistency, where do all these paradoxes come from? And as I delved deeper into it, I realized, the media and our political system and our inequalities play a really big role in that. I would say fairly masochistic as a graduate student as I was getting my doctorate, because not only was I working on this project on the war on drugs, but I was also completing my dissertation, which was about a 14-month ethnography, where I was also, doing this completely other big research project. This is almost kind of like a vanity project for me, just thinking about something I had been interested in for a long time. And, I'm really grateful that actually, I've managed to get some publications out of it and eventually write this book. But essentially that's kind of my long winding path from, sort of disgruntled teenager in the suburbs to being a sociologist who wrote a book about the war on drugs.
And as a sociologist, there is a word that I would apply to your book, and I think that word is methodical. This is not some, half-baked process. Your book was a lot of work. Can you talk a little bit so the listeners really understand why I'm saying that this was something that you spent just so much time on? Yeah.
Well, I think, first of all, I have such a deep respect for anyone that writes a book, because, the writing, beyond just the research was a whole nother thing. But, sociology is an empirical social science. That means I can't just make claims that are based on anything other than evidence. The book is filled with citations. The book is filled with evidence. Every single, thing that I think, maybe this is a thing that just happened out of nowhere. I'm responsible for trying to understand the historical and social forces that led to a particular issue. I've always been sort of an innately curious person. I've kind of have a tendency to sort of like hyper focus on something and get really lost in all of the details and get really far into the weeds. And I really lucked out to be able to find a career that actually rewards me for that. So that's been really incredible. But yeah, the research itself that went into this book was not only just looking at, what other people have written about the war on drugs or looking into historical documents or something like that. I would say the part that was the most tedious and difficult was that the book, sort of the core of the book is me essentially doing an analysis of thousands, around 3,000 newspaper articles that have been published since the early 80s on the war on drugs, as well as, 300 articles, about 3,000 internet comments that were posted on news sites that discussed the war on drugs. And that process itself was very daunting, very draining. As anyone who spent any kind of significant time online knows, the comment section is about the worst place you could possibly go. I would recommend, maybe, especially after this, that people maybe stay away from the comment sections or take a break if you feel pulled into it. If you feel that that endorphin rush or that serotonin, to get pulled into a random argument. But it was a really great source of data for trying to understand just something really basic, which is, what are people saying about drugs and drug policy? We've for so long, the war on drugs has been this hot button issue. Everyone has opinions about drug policy, and since I've written this book, I've received so many unsolicited opinions about drug policy, how the government should handle drug use, what types of things we should be worried about, what's at stake. And so what I really wanted to do is look at, what are the overall themes? What are the big ideas that are really shaping this debate? And then where do those ideas come from? And how are they determining some of these things that we might all be noticing about sort of the paradoxical treatment of people and substances? And so I would definitely not recommend reading thousands of internet comments, but it definitely paid off for me. And it really gave me a really holistic view, a big picture view of the types of points and ideas that really have played a big role in our drug war debate, our drug policy debate as a society.
Yeah, I love that, rule number one of the internet is stay out of the comment section. And rule number one of your book was, I'm going to wade into the comment section. It's very impressive. If you had to guess, how long did just the research part of this book take you?
I would say just the research part was maybe about 2 years.
Oh my God.
I was going through a phase where I was really kind of in this grinding things out, almost workaholic phase. I was a little bit younger. I really can't do that anymore. And, I'm glad I kind of have slowed down. But yeah, I can remember, for instance, being on winter break, I'm at a family member's house, and it's a few days before Christmas. And what am I doing but just sitting here reading racist internet comments, because I think at some point it'll pay off in some kind of way. So, yeah, I mean, doing this kind of research, it takes a lot of dedication and a lot of time and energy. Usually it has to be something that you really care about, I would say. I think that's really what kind of stuck me with it. It was I really want to figure this out. I really want to understand why things are like this in really a really broad sense. And it for me, the research was actually transformative of how I think about and view all these issues. So, it had a really profound impact on my own perception of things like drug use, drug policy, race and ethnicity. And so that was actually a really good experience for me as well.
So your book starts with two chapters, or the first chapter, the introduction, is a really interesting couple of 20 pages or so for anyone who wants a sort of a broader view. But then you get really down to the nitty-gritty in this. And I think personally the most fascinating part of your book was chapter 3. This is just my own opinion, obviously, but which is about how the media frames the war on drugs. And I kind of came away from it. And this is one of those places where you can tell me, no, this is very wrong. But I came away from it honestly believing, if it was not for the media, while the war on drugs would have continued to be the disastrous policy that it has been, the blowing up to a broader scale to being a social encompassing issue would never have happened. Am I right on that, or am I way off base?
I think, it's really difficult to say. I think that's a difficult hypothesis. Can we imagine a world without the media? I mean, we're doing the media right now. So even a sociologist, I don't think, can really wrap their heads around that. But I think you're definitely right in the sense that the media plays a much larger role than we often think in sort of constraining our policy debates. On one hand, amplifying certain voices, on the other hand, silencing others. And I think, the amount of one of the things that I think is really interesting is the spaces that have opened up for people to express their experiences, thoughts, and opinions on something, on an issue like this, has had definitely an impact on how things are discussed and talked about. I obviously, the trends that I looked at were fairly consistent from about the early 80s to the early 2010s. But who knows what this might look like if I were to go back and do it now, particularly after sort of America's quote unquote racial reckoning, the backlash to that racial reckoning that's taking place right now, the explosion of specific types of social media that are shaped by algorithms. All of those things, more than we'd like to think, are influencing these big public debates that are shaping the way that people think about big policy issues. So every time we think about a policy and we think about this policy outcome, the media plays such a big role in shaping public perceptions. And we can probably even think of, there are a few moments, I would say, when Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow came out, it's definitely spurred more debate. I think that when some of the things around the CIA's role in the crack epidemic began to get a little bit more light, it probably shifted public opinion. But when it comes to how the media frames the debate, as the chapter is called, the media has had actually a pretty consistent narrative on the war on drugs. It's particularly around sort of why the war on drugs or drug policies need to be reformed. And that's what I found to be so fascinating, is that certain arguments for reforming drug laws were so consistent, almost like accepted wisdom of like, you kind of have to talk about these points if you want to argue for reforming our drug laws. And you kind of should not emphasize these points because they're less convenient. And seeing that so across the board, across, whether it was local newspapers, big newspapers, like I said, over decades, that was surprising to me. I actually expected to see a lot more change. So, yeah, I mean, really, I wanted to highlight the role of the media and what it does and how it influences these conversations we're all having.
You discuss what I think is a really interesting, or let me say this a different way. You put a name to something that I think is a very understood concept, but you discuss it through the lens of the war on drugs here, which is you call the common sense myths. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that idea and how they come into play on this topic?
Yeah. So common sense myths are things that I think most people believe to be true or just kind of accept as a fact, particularly when it relates to, we can really ground it in these examples of the war on drugs, but things that people believe to be true or accept as sort of, well, that's common sense, that's obvious, that it turns out are complete myths. When we look at almost any drug policy, particularly punitive drug policies that are about punishing people for drug use, there's always some kind of myth that is exaggerating the moral or public health impact of the drug use itself in order to depict it as a threat to justify some type of reaction. And these myths, so for instance, one of the myths that I really identified in the book is I think most people don't know that for the majority of, the best available evidence that we have about history and what's going on right now, the majority of not only drug use, but drug sales and even drug distributing, drug trafficking is done by white people. It's done by people who are of, European origin. Considering the sort of moral panics that people have about violent urban gangs or about, these sort of foreign drug smuggling rings that really pose a threat, just that one basic myth has shaped so much of the way that even drug reformers talk about the war on drugs. So, there's this assumption that the war on drugs is bad because it empowers and gives resources to these violent, criminal, usually, racialized others who are either, Black or Latinx. Those tend to be depicted as like drug criminals in the media. And just that one misconception even shapes those kind of reform arguments that this is, that violent Black and Latinx gangs and people are the primary, dysfunction of the war on drugs, that it's created this quote unquote black market. And so, seeing how those myths become common sense, what their function is and how they're impacting the debate and the policies, I think is really important. And really what I want is for people to push back against those myths. That's why, I hope that more people will read the book so that when they're having conversations about drug policy or drug use or something like that, if nothing else, when one of these myths or assumptions is alluded to, that they can actually push back and say, well, that's not actually true. And then that actually changes the entire scope of the conversation. Just some of these basic facts that researchers have found and proven that have been kind of, locked out of the debate. They haven't been accepted as truth. So that's one. There's obviously quite a few others in the book. At the risk of spoiling it, I won't talk about those.
Well, that we're going to talk towards the end about things we can all do with some of this information. But before we get into my next round of questions, let's pause real quick. And if you wouldn't mind shouting out where people can find you online, where they can buy the book, anything you want people to know.
Absolutely. My Twitter handle is Michael Rosino. My last name is spelled Rosino. I'm pretty active on Twitter. I guess I didn't really learn my lesson after doing this research. But I do use it as a space to, talk about not only my work, but to publicize relevant, political activism going on in communities, news stories, research, information. I also post a lot of really cute pictures of my cats. So that might also be sort of a main draw for people. My website is michaelrosino.com. The book, you can publish it pretty much anywhere. I know that sometimes you partner with bookshops. So I will say specifically try to buy my book through bookshop. Let's cut Jeff Bezos out of the process. You can also buy it at Routledge.com. That's the publisher. But it's pretty much available at any major online retailer as well. And if you happen to be someone who's teaching a class about drug use or drug policy, you can also get a review copy through the website and get a free copy and consider using it in a classroom, because it does have discussion questions. It has a glossary. It's very much designed to sort of spur and provoke discussion. And, that classroom discussion around these issues, I think, as I've already used it in some of my classes, it's been pretty fruitful.
Hey, y'all, it's me, your host. I'm sorry to interrupt what I'm sure is a fantastic episode of the podcast, but I have to give a quick shout out to my partner, Roadrunner CBD. They have been working with me for a while now, and I just love their products. They have everything from tinctures to muscle gels, and all of them are fantastic. I rub the muscle gel on my legs before I run, and they keep me feeling pretty good, which is saying something. So check out Roadrunner today at their website, www.roadrunnercbd.com/ref, REF/CYS. Again, that's roadrunnercbd.com/ref/CYS, and use the code CYS at checkout to let them know that I sent you and get 10% off. Trust me, you're gonna love this. I've sent some of their products to a couple different people, and they've all become repeat customers. So check it out today, and don't forget to let them know that Choose Your Struggle sent you. Find me on social media. Check the link in the show notes or search for me, Jay Schiffman, on YouTube and LinkedIn, and Choose Your Struggle on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I learned a lot from this book, obviously, as a person who sort of researches this full time, but am nowhere close to the research level that you did on this. Was there anything that you came in either thinking one thing and then obviously your research changed your mind, or was there any sort of big surprises for you in the research?
I would say there were two, because, I want to have the humility to say that some of, common sense myths impact everyone. That's why they're sort of common sense. Everyone is walking around, in any topic that I haven't done this much research on, I'm just as likely as anyone else to have some type of misconception about it, and I think it's worth owning that. So before I went into this project, I think, there were probably a few things that I thought, if I can kind of time travel back to that mind state, I think the probably a major one was just not understanding the historical scope and scale of punitive drug policies, realizing that, I'd always thought, like many people, that the war on drugs is like something that Nixon said in the 60s, Reagan made it real in the 80s. This is kind of our pop history, I think, that we have. But I didn't know that even dating all the way back to, the 1870s, there were punitive drug laws that were targeting Chinese immigrants over their opening of opium dens in San Francisco and California, that, even back then, so early on in our country's history, that there was a racist moral panic around substance use that led to a broader wave of, and fed into what's known as the yellow peril, which is this whole idea that Chinese immigrants at the time in the late 1800s, early 1900s were seen as like these foreign invaders, this foreign horde that could take over America. They were seen as fundamentally unable to like assimilate into American society. And also that's led to one of the first exclusionary immigration policies that literally said we're going to exclude an entire ethnicity of people from the United States. So I think one thing was just how old this is. This story that comes through in the book about sort of the way that policymakers and the media connect different substances to different ethnic groups as a means of demonizing not only the users of that substance, but the members of that group, and justify unequal treatment, has been happening for centuries. And I had no idea. So I would say that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is that I just really didn't understand that discussions of racial inequality and racial justice have played actually such a small role in the public drug policy debate over the past few decades. So at the risk of spoiling maybe another myth is that I think, all of us I think a lot of people who really delve into the war on drugs, I think a lot of people are familiar with like, okay, reefer madness, the crack epidemic and how that corresponds with like targeting certain communities, or the different like scares that have happened around different substances. I think people are kind of vaguely aware of that, but I don't think people necessarily understand or talk about very frequently the scope and scale of discrimination that takes place in the legal system, how that leads to these pipelines that are feeding into outcomes like Black and Latinx people in the United States being, the majority of the prison population, despite being a minority of the population at large. Things like that, like really understanding that process And I didn't really understand the extent to which that was purely a reflection of the policies and the way that people are treated and discrimination and targeting that's taking place. Before I did my research, I probably would have thought, well, maybe that's going on. But I think anyone a sociologist who studies inequality, it's almost like you're taking like a conspiracy theory and then you're going, oh my God, there's so much evidence for this. And that's not to, make myself sound like a crackpot, but in the sense that, these mechanisms can actually be proven, as I attempted to do in the book. And so I think I just wasn't aware of where those disparities came from. I was aware that they existed. I thought they were kind of fucked up. I thought it wasn't good. Maybe I had some sense of that. But I think that was one of the things that really blew my mind is just not only the historical scope, but how much of issues like mass incarceration or the hyper policing and incarceration of certain communities is so deeply linked to drug policies and how they're enforced specifically.
So 2 points on that. Number one, I really appreciate the highlighting of the historical context, because that's something that I talk about, probably my listeners would say, ad nauseum on this show. But the second point that I think is so interesting is that another thing that your book does so well is really cast a net to show just how many different arguments are being used when we talk about this topic, both positive and negative, right? You have people on both sides of the war on drugs who talk about it, as you've been saying, from a criminal justice and a racist, racial standpoint. But the bigger one, if I'm reading your book correctly, was actually a financial discussion, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, I think, that really has. So there were kind of two big ones, I guess I would say. The actual biggest one is an argument that we hear all the time, which is the war on drugs has failed, that it's dysfunctional. The second largest is one that I think we're also all familiar with if we've been following drug policy, which is that it's a financial issue. That, people talk about how much taxpayer money has been basically thrown in the trash, as a way of putting it. There's kind of this libertarian argument that it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. It kind of corresponds with the argument about the war on drugs being a bad investment because it's a failure. What it was intended to do and what it's failed to do is really not clear, because, very critical types like myself would say that the war on drugs was intentionally designed to reproduce racial oppression. And so it's been very effective at that. I wouldn't consider it a failure. Maybe by some of the talking points that are used to uphold it, it's been a failure. But the financial argument is so interesting because we can see glimmers of that in the current debate around cannabis policy reform that are taking place in, at the state level right now. So many states have recently legalized or decriminalized cannabis. I think there's a growing consensus that, federal decriminalization is likely inevitable at some point. And it's interesting because, I even was thinking when Governor Cuomo announced that he wanted to try to look at legalizing cannabis in New York. His first argument that he led with for why it was good was all about that it would generate tax revenue, that it would generate money for the state, that it would stop sort of wasting money on failed programs and policies. The secondary argument that I think he was making to communities, but not to elites, to the actual communities impacted by the war on drugs was, okay, yeah, also, there's like unjust policing practices and like people are being stopped and frisked and like, that's bad too. But more importantly, we can raise a lot of revenue for the state of New York. We might be able to lower the taxes of some elites because we'll get all these sales taxes. It'll be a boon to industry. We'll get all these weed entrepreneurs into the state and it'll revitalize the economy. and these types of arguments really take precedent a lot of times and kind of eclipse the very real human toll of the actual war on drugs. The injustice and oppression side of it is oftentimes eclipsed by just this idea that it's such a this untapped industry. And I think, capitalism creates a lot of perverse incentives for the interests. For any type of reform to happen, it kind of has to align with some argument that economic elites can kind of wrap their heads around. And I find that the financial argument has increasingly become that argument for a lot of drug reform policies that sort of make it seem like, okay, this is common sense. People can also get rich off of it. People that are already very wealthy can invest and make millions or even billions of dollars off of this emergent industry. So I find that to be really interesting and fascinating, especially as we talk about the emergence of the cannabis industry. Who are the players involved? Who's benefiting from it? Who's being locked out? We can kind of see the toll that this purely capitalistic sort of financial reasoning has actually played in some of the outcomes we see in how these policies actually play out. So, I think, and like I said, I think these aren't frames that are going to blow anyone's mind necessarily, because if you've had a conversation about drug policy, you've probably heard some of these, many of these points before. People can kind of just list them off. But really looking at the impacts that it has on the debate and our policy was really fascinating to me.
So couple points on that into my next question. That is, I think, a really important distinction to make, because there has been, I would say this is a minority, but there has been a if you keep track of some of these storylines, attempt to sort of rewrite history in the sense of, oh, people realized the rights of their wrongs and they decided to legalize cannabis. That's not what happened. Mm-hmm. We've never once heard a person in a boardroom say the words, "I was wrong about the dangers of cannabis." While we have had incredible people like past guests on the show, Mason Tavert, who really helped get Colorado and California to legalize, all of the changes afterwards have been because they were able to make money off of it.
Absolutely.
So the question I guess I have for you going into what I mentioned before is, number one, do you see that as a viable way to then help decriminalize or legalize other substances? And number two, sort of using that as a springboard, what can we do with all of this incredible information in your book to affect positive change?
I would say that, that's a really interesting question. I think America right now is really gripped with, I guess, what I would call like cannabis exceptionalism. I think that there is an entirely, there's two parallel conversations that take place. One is, okay, I guess we can all recognize cannabis has been exaggerated in terms of its negative impacts, and that's not considered controversial anymore. But I think, you think about someone like Dr. Carl Hart, who, also studies drug use, coming out, acknowledging that he uses heroin, for instance, and the amount of stigma and backlash that still came along with that, even though researchers have been saying for years that all of the illicit drugs that, even the ones that we think of as like hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, opiates, the majority of users of those drugs don't develop substance use disorders. People have been studying, the specific contexts, social contexts and psychological processes that lead drug use to become or that lead substance use to become someone developing a substance use disorder. But I think that hasn't really penetrated the conversation. I think that right now, it's kind of like there is definitely this thing where it's like, okay, we'll let you have weed. That's fine. Don't push it. I think there's still, I think that there is a massive system, the criminal, sort of the criminal justice system and the prison industrial complex is still banking on most Americans having an extremely stigmatized view of other substances and having that as a boogeyman. I think that, it would be, I am very much in favor of taking a totally sort of harm reduction / pleasure maximization approach to substance use. As you can see in the book, I'm very pro evidence-based policies, even though that oftentimes feels like, talking into a void. But I think that in an ideal world, that is a viable way of addressing different substances. I'm not sure that creating a profit incentive is necessarily creates healthy incentives for just about anything, including, when I talk about how the media is run or anything. I don't know that there should necessarily be a profit incentive. And I would actually probably prefer if the cannabis industry were maybe more of a nonprofit industry. But I think it's entirely possible to, imagine a system where we entirely cut the legal system out of it and entirely remove the punitive aspects of our approach to all drugs. And I think one of the things that is worth considering is the fact that we do kind of take this approach to other substances. So like, there's clearly people who are making tons and tons of money off of prescription opiates. So we can see some of the dysfunction there, but that, it's all about sort of what is convenient, what is convenient for the interests of elites. And I don't want to be too overly cynical about it, but I do think that is going to take a lot more pushback. And I think the important thing is once again, pushing back at the stage that we're at is just pushing back against the falsehoods, pushing back against the myths, and not allowing these dominant narratives to stigmatize our fellow human beings who use substances, whether they're struggling with a substance use disorder or they use substances in a way that isn't disordered and isn't disrupting their lives in any kind of way, that they're human beings who deserve support and care. I think pushing that kind of idea, I think, is really crucial for even getting to that next phase where we can say, okay, how do we actually want to treat this as a society?
Before we get into the final couple of questions that I always close the show with, if you wouldn't mind one more time shouting out where people can find you, where they can buy the book, and anything else you want them to know.
So people can find me, if you're interested, actually, I will also say for particularly like nerdy listeners who really want to get into some of the nitty gritty of this, if you go to my Google Scholar page, you can probably find, or even on my personal website, michaelrosino.com, you can find some of the more, scholarly research articles I've written about this as well that are less sort of contextualized, but get even more into some of my analysis of these media representations and their impacts. At Michael Rosino on Twitter, feel free to follow me. My email is mrosino@malloy.edu. That's my work email. But if anyone's interested in collaborating or connecting, if there's anything you want to do with maybe some of this research, or you think some of the information that I'm providing can be helpful to you personally or an organization, I'm always happy to do interviews, guest lectures, talk to people. I love to connect with other people who are active and passionate about this kind of work. So please feel free to reach out to me in any kind of way like that. I would say those are probably the main ways to connect with me.
Fantastic. Well, as you know, because you've heard the show, we always finish with the same two questions every time. The first of which is, what are your self-care habits?
My self-care habits are I would say, number one, giving myself permission to be lazy. I want to give a shout out to a book I read recently called Laziness Does Not Exist. It's written by a social psychologist, And essentially what they have done is go through and use research and evidence. It's written in a really accessible way, probably even more so than my book. And it talks about all of the evidence that most people actually, that what we consider laziness as a society is usually someone struggling with a mental health condition or burnout. And so that's been a major sort of internal self-care practice for me. There's so much pressure in our society to be a hustler, a go-getter, workaholic. People brag about how many hours they work. And I even kind of got caught up in that because it really is rewarded in academia. And so I would say, the biggest kind of breakthrough I had was just making that connection of what they call the laziness lie, and being like, no, it's okay for me to do nothing. Doing nothing is great. So I would say that's a big one. I love to take bubble baths. So like with bath bombs and all that kind of stuff. I now live in, this is my first sort of like adult apartment. My partner and I live in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, in a really nice apartment that we definitely couldn't have afforded before our current jobs. And it is the first place that I've lived in a really long time with a functioning bathtub. So I've really been enjoying that. I love listening to podcasts. I love playing video games. There's a lot of Switch games that I play that are just kind of relaxing, turn your brain off. I love doing yoga, all of those kinds of things. I would say those are kind of the big ones that I really try to practice. And, going to therapy, talking to a therapist is obviously huge for me and so many other people. First of all, so I'm not like dumping all my problems onto my partner and she's like, talk to somebody else. But because it's so great to get someone else's perspective, to feel validated to work through those kind of issues. So, I'm probably not giving anyone like new ideas they've never heard of before, but those have been really groundbreaking for me to discover and make part of like my habits.
I love it, man. That was very thorough and a lot of wonderful ideas in there. You're I think the third person in the last like month who said bubble baths. And so I got to tell you, I've never been a bath person, but this is making me rethink my position on that.
It'll change your sleep. That's the big thing. If you take one in the evening, and kind of just transition into bed, like once you're drying off, and you will sleep so good.
I love it, man. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, the last question that we always ask is the one that I know you're waiting for, which is we've now spent the last 45 minutes hearing why you're incredible. We should all be checking out your work. But who are some other people you're following, listening to, reading, watching, whatever you want to shout out?
Yeah, so it actually in the book, this is like the conclusion of the book, I list a lot of activists and organizations that are doing really great work on these issues. So I definitely want to give a big shout out to the Drug Policy Alliance. They have been doing really amazing work at, shifting the conversation around drug policy, really making sure that questions of racial equity, as we're reforming these policies, that they are front and center. So the Drug Policy Alliance is a great organization. I also want to give a shout out to the Center for Community Change. They're also doing a lot of great work around this. The NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Those are probably some big ones. I've really appreciated people like Dr. Carl Hart, who I'm sure listeners are aware of, who have really tried to normalize and destigmatize substance use. I think that, one thing that I want to, just encourage listeners to do is, as they're paying attention to these current policy debates around drug policy, is just to keep in mind that this is a great opportunity to right these wrongs. And so if you look into organizations like the Drug Policy Alliance, they are really making sure that when policies do get passed, that they're equitable, that they are actually an opportunity for marginalized communities to benefit from these new policies, that they're not creating new ways that people of color or low-income people are caught up in the web. They've been really effective in sort of shaping the current cannabis laws in New York that have a lot of that focus. So I want to encourage people to pay attention to those things. I would say, yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for all of that. A lot of great ones in there. Huge Carl Hart fan here, and you know, I definitely echo the Drug Policy Alliance shout out. My listeners know I had Kellen Rosino from Drug Policy Alliance on here last summer, and we did a big fundraiser for them. So definitely check those out. And Michael, thank you so much for coming on. This has been fascinating. I cannot say enough, listeners. Go check out Debating the Drug War, Race, Politics, and the Media. Yes, buy it from Bookshop, but you know, if you see it at your little neighborhood bookstore or something like that, pick it up there too. It's definitely a wonderful read and will open your eyes. So, Michael, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Jay. This was fun.
The Choose Your Struggle podcast has been so lucky to have numerous truly change-making authors on this show. From Adi Jaffe to Emily Dufton, we have been blessed by hearing them speak, and now it's time to grab their works. Now, you could go to Amazon if you wanted to shop online, but let's be honest, that's not the right choice. So I'm going to invite you to head over to my partner, Bookshop. If you go to bookshop.org/shop/CYS, again, that's bookshop.org/shop/CYS, you're going to find all of your favorite books, and you're going to support the podcast in the process. But that's not even the best part. Bookshop has an incredible program that allows you to select your favorite mom and pop or neighborhood bookstore, and they will give them some of the proceeds from your order. Now, living here in Philly, that's been a really hard choice because we have fantastic bookstores all over, but I selected Harriet's, which is a truly wonderful Black-owned bookstore in Northern Philly. I love it. My wife loves it. We go there as much as we can. Honestly, why would you go anywhere else? So again, go check out Bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/CYS. You're going to find the book you're looking for. You're going to support your neighborhood bookstore, and you're going to support the podcast in the process. So check it out today and go ahead and buy that book you've been waiting for. Subscribe to my Patreon for behind-the-scenes looks at the podcast, sneak peeks, and bonus data. You'll also get a discount on Choose Your Struggle merch. Find it at patreon.com/chooseyourstruggle. All right, we've come to the end of another episode of the Choose Your Struggle podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Michael Rosino. I found his work to be incredibly fascinating, and I cannot recommend the book enough. So reach out, and I'm going to send it to you. And if you're interested and it's already been taken, I'll send you a sticker or something. So there is no downside to reaching out this week. Definitely do so. All right, your card this week is going to be from the Train Your Brain card pack. This is by Jennifer Sweeten, Dr. Jennifer Sweeten. Here is your card. Locating resources. Most of us have resources in the body, which are places that feel safe, strong, or peaceful. To connect with those areas, first identify the positive experience that you have hoped to connect with in the body, such as calm or happiness. Now focus on your body, slowly moving your attention upward from your feet, legs, and chest all the way through your head. As you scan each region, ask yourself, is this resource in your body? Is the resource in this area of my body? Jot down what you discover so you can remember to connect with these resourced areas. That's interesting. I have never heard of that idea before of having, I don't even know what that means. I'll say this. If someone tries this and comes up or figures that out, I would love to hear from you. If this is something that you are into already, this idea of resources in the body, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out. Maybe I can even have you as a snippet on an intro or an outro or something. because this is totally foreign to me. What the calm, like I get the idea, I guess, of there being calm and happiness in your body, but how I don't know, like having it hidden or finding it, like that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So if this is something that you have tried, if this is something that you do on the regular, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. All right, your good egg for today is going to be pretty simple. It's just going to be stand up for yourself. And it doesn't have to be in an assholeish way. I think a lot of times we think of standing up for yourself like puffing out your chest, and no, that's not what I'm talking about. To put this in, or sort of bring this home. So, we're renting this house in Philadelphia, and we love the area. The house is fine. Unfortunately for the owner, the house is either a lemon, or when he had it redone, they did a terrible job because there's something wrong with it every single day. I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but I'm sitting on a call, and all of a sudden my feet were wet. And I was like, that's not a thing that's supposed to happen. And I look up, and the wall is just it's not like pouring, but it is more than a trickle coming through the wall. So I immediately jump up. I'm on a Zoom, and I start tearing everything away from this wall. I take down pictures. It was because, like I said, it was not just a trickle. There was significant water coming in through the wall. Now, okay, freak stuff happens. No, we had reported when the day we moved in, which was almost 4 months ago, that there was already water damage in this area. You could see it, and they had said, don't worry about it. And now, I was lucky, something that I care about very deeply. I think I mentioned this actually when I was talking about this experience, was I have a book that my grandmother wrote about my now deceased grandfather, signed by both of them. It is one of my cherished possessions. Luckily, it did get a little wet, but luckily I was able to save it. And I have a signed jersey that was on the wall that the back out. It was annoying because we had told them about this problem and they dismissed us. And now there's another thing that they are trying not to fix because the owner decided he didn't want to spend the money. I guess to our property manager's credit, she has told us that, that the owner is just like, nah, I don't want to do it. So I finally had enough this week, and I'm sure this will have played out by the time this comes out. Of course it will have. But I finally stood up for us, and I said, this is ridiculous. Not only are these basic things, but it's also in the lease. There's one of the problems is literally in the lease, and they're not doing it. So at first we were trying to be good tenants. We were trying to be helpful and just deal with it. And now we're just like, nah, we're done with that. So, stuff happens. Obviously, you don't want to be that person that demands satisfaction every time a little thing happens. But we have gone above and beyond. This has been going on for 4 months now without any resolutions. I think it's time that we were okay to stand up for ourselves. So that's your good egg. Stand up for yourself. Make sure that you are aware of your worth and communicate that. So but above all else, as always, be vulnerable, show your empathy, spread your love, and choose your struggle.